All right, so before I start, quick show of hands. How many people know what Kubernetes is and et cetera? Excellent. Okay, so I don't have to explain all the complex terms. All right, so, I'm sorry? All right, so Kubernetes is a container structure, basically allowing you to run various applications and services on what they call pods. A pod is kind of like a mini operating system. It's a bit simpler than a whole VM. And the fun thing about it is you can run several pods on a single VM. So you get pods on VMs, on hardware, and it gets really complicated after a while. So basically, when we first started running Sauce, when I first got back to Dell, we were running it on a bunch of Windows VMs. Okay? And in order to economize, we were running multiple tunnels on a single VM. We run our tunnels in parallels on 2 redundant VMs, so we lose a tunnel, no big deal. Only problem was we had people requesting custom tunnels with custom host files. Problem is, you stick a host file on a VM, and all of a sudden, all the tunnels on that VM are using that host file, which led to mobs with torches and pitchforks approaching my desk. This was not fun. So this is what we did. Instead of running a single tunnel on a single VM, we were running a single tunnel on a single Kubernetes pod. This gave us the capability to run a single tunnel with its own customized host file, thus allowing people to customize their DNS resolution to however they wanted. Now, at Dell, we run multiple DNS instances. We have a fairly complex environment of SIT servers. We have 4 separate SIT environments, each one with its own DNS. So depending on what your DNS is set to, www.dell.com will redirect to either production or one of the SIT environments. Unfortunately, we also have a whole bunch of other servers that are used for internal apps that we don't have in the multiple DNSs and that change periodically for testing purposes. That's why we needed host files. So this is basically the whole solution in a pipeline. So you get your pipeline pulling code from your repository, compiling it, et cetera. Then we run our analysis for security and source code. Then we run our unit tests. And then we get to the fun part, the functional tests. So because we're running our tunnels in Kubernetes pods, we also have the capability of allowing people to set up entirely custom tunnels in addition to the static tunnels that we run already. So we have an app called the Tunnel Manager that has both a web interface where you can go in there and manually request a tunnel for ad hoc testing. It also has a web service interface where you can basically automate a tunnel startup as part of your CI/CD pipeline. So there's a small command line app written in .NET Core that sits out on all our runners and that they call to start a tunnel. When they start a tunnel, they get an identifier for the tunnel. When they're finished with their tests, they can call that same command line with that identifier and shut down the tunnel when they're done. If they don't shut down the tunnel, it gets shut down at the end of 6 hours anyways by our automated tunnel manager software. Behind the scenes, like I said, we have the tunnel manager, which allows them to manually create the tunnels. The tunnel arbiter, trust me, thesauruses are your best friend when it comes down to naming apps. I had to come up with different words for manager. So the tunnel arbiter is basically an application that shows the status of all the tunnels, but it's also a service that runs and shuts down the tunnels after whatever length of time they were set up for when they started. And the tunnel command line utility that I mentioned before. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. I want to go ahead and leave the rest of the time for questions if anybody has any. Yes?
Do you have the code available anywhere for us to see?
It is currently closed source. It's unfortunately, I'm talking with Dell management to see if we can open source it. There's, of course, all kinds of legal ramifications and discussions to discuss with them that I don't get to decide. Yes?
Did you run containers before Kubernetes and then had to migrate the container structure into the Kubernetes architecture?
We used...
Hold on. Can you repeat that?
Sorry. Did you use containers before you were in Kubernetes, and then did you have to migrate that tunnel, that container architecture into the Kubernetes system, and how did that work?
No, we didn't actually. Well, okay, I take that back. We were using Docker. We were creating Docker images, and then we started running the Docker images on Kubernetes. So fortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of migration. I just had to make a few changes to the Docker image to work on Kubernetes. There's basically the way it works when you start up a tunnel, there's a shell script that runs that looks at all the environment variables that get passed in and creates the SauceConnect command line that then starts the tunnel. Anybody else?
Do you
Okay.
Hey, I have a questions.
Okay.
Do you make those Docker image yourself, or it's online? You can grab it from Source Lab or something?
We created the Docker image based on an existing SauceConnect tunnel image. Okay, we basically took the Docker file for that, made some modifications to it to allow our customized environment variables and our host file entries. That was the fun part about this, getting this to work correctly and allowing people to essentially create their own ad hoc host file for the container. So on the web interface, there's basically a section where they enter in all of their host file entries, the IP address, and all the host names that resolve to it. And when they do it via a service, it's part of a JSON configuration file that they have to pass in through the command line interpreter to then create the host file. Yes?
So you're obviously familiar, well, I'm guessing you're probably familiar with our high availability configuration, SauceConnect high availability configuration, where we usually have people running static VMs with static SauceConnect instances for high availability mode. Do you think this is more stable than that?
Stability wasn't really our goal with this. Our goal was more responsiveness to customers' requests. Rather than me having to take 15, 20 minutes to create a custom tunnel for them every time that they requested it, they now have the capability to do it themselves, and I can sit back and drink my coffee.
Yeah. So why were they requesting different kinds of tunnels?
Most of it was custom host file configurations. Okay, when basically, for example, they have their own test database server that has test data that they want to use for their tests, and so they want to redirect www.testdata.dell.com to their server. Now that entry usually doesn't even exist in our DNS, and getting it into our DNS is an exercise in emails and forms, et cetera, so it's much easier to do this with a host file and not have to bother the network guys and let them sit and drink their coffee.
Okay, cool, that makes sense. So then back in terms of stability, so I noticed that you guys had an automatic shutdown that you guys were doing after a specific period of time. What if any tests are running during that time? Would it wait for the test to finish, or would it shut them down prematurely?
It should do a graceful shutdown of the tunnel to where the tunnel will simply stop taking requests and finish executing the existing tests that are going through the tunnel.
Okay, cool. And then if someone wants to start the tunnel back up, they just gotta rerun whatever command line utility or use the web interface.
Right.
If that's what they want to do.
Pretty much. We figured 6 hours is a good beginning place to get them set up. Their tests should finish within 6 hours. If we get requests, we'll lengthen the period.
Okay, cool. I think one final question. Sorry, I'm just super interested.
By all means, go ahead. We got lots of time left.
So why limit it to 6 hours? Well, what was the decision to do that?
Mostly because Sauce restricts the number of tunnels we can have open at any one time. Okay, we don't want to saturate that and get to the point where we can't open any more tunnels because there's all these tunnels sitting over here that somebody created and didn't clean up.
Okay, cool. Thanks, man.
Sure. Anybody else?
Can you regale us with any of the horror stories you've had dealing with Kubernetes, or any impacts on your CI/CD pipeline because of the switch to Kubernetes?
I'm sorry, those are classified.
Okay.
No. Okay. Dell is a fairly large company, as y'all are aware, so we don't have a single development organization. We probably got somewhere around a dozen or 2 dozen different development orgs in there. And of course, they all use all sorts of interesting things: Java, Python, Node.js, .NET, whatever they want to use. So we had to come up, I work for the actual DevOps department as the test automation lead, and we basically had to come up with a DevOps infrastructure that would suit them, suit everybody. And we're using GitLab for source control and also for our CI/CD pipelines. So of course, we've got these GitLab runners that themselves are running on Kubernetes. So basically, we spin up a new Kubernetes pod with a new runner whenever a build happens. So making sure that everybody's development environment and build environment was satisfied in these pods was a challenge. We still get requests, can you update to the latest version of .NET, or can you put this compiler on there, et cetera, et cetera. So we try to be responsive to that, but it does require, that's still a bit of a manual step that the the other DevOps guys are working on trying to figure out a way to make all of that happen for the developer so that they can get their builds done in a timely manner and their tests done in a timely manner.
I also usually get a lot of requests to have custom tunnels. I just got one yesterday, and while I was at the conference. So could you explain a little bit about how you separate out the custom configurations from your, and how does it help you start and stop the tunnels?
Sure. Basically, in our Kubernetes cluster, we have multiple namespaces. We have a separate namespace for the static tunnels. All the static tunnels run there. And we have 2 separate clusters for those. So we're still running redundant tunnels for the static tunnels. Then we have a custom namespace for the on-demand tunnels. So when they get created in that namespace. So as this stuff is being tested, I'll be going in there periodically, making sure we don't have a whole lot of orphan tunnels sitting out there or something, because that means that there's something wrong with the arbiter and it's not shutting down tunnels correctly. So namespaces in Kubernetes are a great way to basically segregate stuff out.
Oh, sorry.
But then what do you do with the configurations, like, for instance, the different ports on which you run these tunnels, or then, say, for example, the direct domains or proxy tunnels and all that information?
Well, the fun thing about the Kubernetes pods is that all the tunnels essentially run on the same port. We run all our tunnels on port 10,000. And since they are essentially independent entities, all their port mappings are also independent, just as if they were on completely separate VMs. Come on, guys, we got lots of time left. Don't leave me hanging out here. Sam, up here.
Oh, Taylor, I'll get you next.
A quick question on how you have your Kubernetes set up. Do you have all of your tunnels set up in one Kubernetes cluster, or do you have one set up per environment?
We have 2 clusters that are set up to run the static tunnels redundantly. So if we have a tunnel called prod, that tunnel runs on both clusters. So we have prod on PC1 and another prod on S3B. That's what we call our data centers. For the on-demand tunnels, they're not redundant. They run on a single cluster. We're running all of those in our S3B cluster, if I remember right. The clusters are geographically separated. In Austin, one's in Parmer, and I believe one's up in Round Rock. So we have a fair amount of redundancy for the static tunnels.
And one unrelated question, kind of got into your CI/CD pipeline. As the lead in the DevOps group, do you guys manage the Docker files or the build environment for your customers, or do you let them handle that?
We do manage it. We use a combination of Artifactory and Harbor to store Docker images and such that they can then use for their builds.
So do you create a base image for them and that they build on top of, or how do you segregate that as an organization?
That one's actually not my specialty, but from what I recall from talking to James, the guy that's running that, they can request that we put a Docker image up on Artifactory or on Harbor for them, or they can create a pipeline for their actual ancillary image that puts it up on Artifactory or Harbor.
Yeah, that was similar to my question, but I guess I was wondering, since you're using Docker, are you using anything like Terraform, or as far as like your CI/CD pipeline, is there any specific tools, or within your cluster, how are you defining like those resources for, I guess, the tunnels?
For the tunnels, basically, like I said, they're just namespaces we created ad hoc. As far as the rest of the CI/CD pipelines, I would have to leave that question to the guys that run it. Although if you get with me after this, I'll see if I can put you in contact with some of them to help answer your questions.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. It's the same people asking questions here. This is great.
Can you tell us a little bit about if you experimented with any file systems such as ZFS or issues with storage and load balancing?
A little bit, yes. We for a product not related to the tunnels, we had kind of a challenge. We're using Azure for some of our stuff, and of course, Azure doesn't directly support the S3B file system, so we had to figure out a way to get our product, which was S3B, to talk to Azure's file system, which is blob storage. So we wound up using something called Minio, which is basically a shim between S3B and blob storage. Talks S3B on one side and blob on the other. But that's as close as we've gotten to that particular issue.
Sorry, another question. But by the way, I'm Nikolai. I talked to you on the phone multiple times.
Oh, hi, Nikolai. How you doing?
Nice to meet you, man. So how much time and resources do you think it took to create this solution? Because it sounds pretty complex, and it sounds awesome, but I'm just wondering.
Calendar time, it took me about a year. Actual work time, because I get pulled off onto multiple issues. Either,
Yeah,
hey, Morgan,
tell me
stop
all.
working on that and
Yeah.
start working on this. So actual work time, probably sometime between 5 and 8 months.
Okay. Just you working on it?
Just me.
Okay.
And believe me, I had to learn a whole bunch of stuff. I actually wrote my very first bash script ever for this thing. I've never written bash before in my life, and that was a challenge. So yeah, there was a lot of learning curve, and I've never worked with Kubernetes before this, so I had to learn a lot about that. So a lot of it was ramp up time, not straight development time. So somebody more familiar with it could probably have done it faster, sure.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Morgan.
Have your teams tried using any tunnels besides SauceConnect? Because where I work, we just tried sort of home rolling a solution with ngrok and then just ended up using SauceConnect. Did your teams try that at any point?
No, we decided not to try and reinvent the wheel, honestly. SauceConnect works pretty well for us. We don't have too much of a problem with it. Part of the reason, actually, that we did move over to Kubernetes and running it on Linux is the Windows versions of the tunnels we did have some stability issues with. But since we've been running them on Linux, they've been rock solid. Anybody else?
Oh, we got one more. Two more.
Boy, Sam, you're getting a good workout here.
Not even wearing my fitness tracker.
How many tests would you say that you run on a tunnel at a given time before it shuts down?
That's a good question, actually. I'm not sure we've ever run those metrics. Does Sauce have metrics on tunnel usage like that on their end?
We like it to be, we like to have one tunnel per every 100 tests you're going to run in parallel.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that the tunnel's going to break if you run more than 100 in parallel, but if your concurrency is 500, we'd like to see you have 5 concurrent tunnels too.
Okay. Well, we actually have 330 VMs on our Sauce Labs cluster. So, and we've actually got 6 static tunnels running at any given time, but that's mostly for DNS segregation, not performance. So we've never had a problem with overloading a tunnel for what that's worth.
To continue on sizing, what did you do to size the container or pods?
Actually, I didn't. I left that up to our PKS guys. I told them what I needed. I told them what the SauceConnect tunnels did and what performance we had seen as far as memory utilization and processor utilization on the VMs. And I let them actually size the individual tunnels or the individual VMs that are behind the cluster. From what I understand, for our static clusters, we have a cluster with 3 VMs, I think it's 8 gigs of RAM each, and only like a 20 or 40 gig disk.
So
disk space is not something critical for SauceConnect. So.
You have your own cluster for just this?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's a general test automation cluster, but right now SauceConnect is the primary user on that one.
Okay. And then did you size the container, the pod sizes, like memory allocation for them at all?
We went, I think, for half a processor for each pod and 1 gig of RAM, I think, for each pod was our sizing.
Okay. Thank you.
And thus far, that's been working fine. We haven't had to change that.
Cool.
I have 15 minutes left, guys. Come on.
Oh, we got one more.
Did you get good feedback how the switch to Kubernetes impacted the non-DevOps part of the organization? Because my company's switching to Kubernetes, and it's sort of like, I don't know what that would mean to me as a QA or how it impacts the dev experience moving forward. So one of the hopes I had from this talk, or just any talk about Kubernetes, was sort of learning what the future holds for that transition?
Okay. The fun thing about Kubernetes, it is still under development. They're still cranking out new versions fairly regularly. And from what I have seen, they're fairly responsive to community concerns. As far as what we saw, when we moved the SauceConnect tunnels over from Windows to Kubernetes, we got a lot of emails saying, oh my God, the tunnels are staying up a whole lot more, thank you. And other things like that. We actually had one organization, our premier organization, that they were running their own tunnels, and about 4 weeks ago, they approached me right before one of them was going on a 2-week cruise and said, hey, I'm going on this cruise, I want these tunnels to stay up while I'm running, can we move them over to your infrastructure? So it's been pretty good. I think overall for Dell as a whole, for testing as a whole, this has been a good thing.
And if any of you are worried about asking a public question, I think Morgan would be okay if you found them at lunch.
Of course.
Okay.
Not a problem. Especially if you buy me a lunch. Oh, wait, it's free. It's free anyway, so never mind. Well, I think I have satisfied everyone's curiosity. I will give you 13 minutes and 58 seconds back.
All right.
Seriously, find me if you have any questions on this. I'm happy to talk about it. Had a nice talk with the USAA guys yesterday, so I really enjoy doing this stuff. I love doing the work for Dell. It's awesome, so I'm happy to talk about it anytime. Oh.
Can we refer our DevOps people to you in some way, shape, or form to get more information moving forward?
I don't think that would be a problem. My consulting rates are reasonable.
Okay.
No, seriously, no problem. I'll be happy to share an email address for anybody that wants to contact me about this.
Yeah, can we find you on social media or somewhere?
The question was, can you find Morgan on social media?
I am on LinkedIn. You can find me there. I'm on Facebook, but I keep that strictly for my own personal use. I don't keep my work stuff on Facebook, but LinkedIn is the best way to find me, or email.
All right. So
All right, folks. Simple topic.
yeah, let's get a round of
Hopefully you
applause
liked
for
it.
Morgan.